Now I'm pleased to introduce Dani Rodrik. Professor Rodrik is the Rafiq Hariri Professor of International Political Economy at the JFK School of Government here at Harvard. He earned his PhD in economics and his MPA at Princeton University, and his research focuses on international economics and economic development. He has earned numerous awards and recognitions for his work, including the inaugural Albert O. Hirschman Prize from the Social Science Research Council in 2007. He's been widely published in scholarly journals, as well as publications like the New York Times and the New Republic, and his books include Has Globalization Gone Too Far? And One Economics, Many Recipes. Professor Rodrik's latest book, The Globalization Paradox, continues his work of challenging the perceived benefits of globalization. The book takes on 3 centuries of economic history and argues that our pursuits of democracy, national autonomy, and economic globalization are at odds with one another, and that going forward we must choose our national priorities.
Thank you all for coming. It's nice to see the crowd here. Let me begin with a confession, which is that I'm an economist. That means you're free to hold me and my friends culpable for everything that we've been going through in the last 3 years. I do think we share some of the blame. But I think I'm a bit of an unusual economist in that if you actually look at the book, you'll see that I'm not trying to sell you globalization. So it's one of these unusual. In this way I want to hold on to it for the whole time. I guess what I've tried to do in this book is play a bit of an unusual role where I try to, on the one hand, explain to economists and the technocrats and the policy people what the concerns of ordinary people about globalization are. And that sort of meant trying to actually understand them and put it in ways and frameworks that could be communicated to the economists, and that's an art in itself. But I also was concerned about trying to explain, why is it that economists think globalization is such a wonderful thing that has done so many good things for so many people around the world. So the book is I hope you'll find, if you look at it, you'll find that. That it's fairly readable. I've tried to make it readable, but there is enough of The Economist in it, and that's why I start out with that confession. I was driving a couple of hours ago on the highway, and I was listening to a news program, and there was somebody being interviewed. It was a Republican being interviewed on economic policy, and the subject was the deficit, of course, and he was saying a lot of things about why the deficit ought to be reduced. And he said, and most fundamentally, most importantly, we have to reduce the deficit so that we can compete in the global economy. And I thought about that, and I said, how many times have we heard this? And just remove the bit about we have to reduce the deficit and substitute any and all of whatever you think this country ought to be doing or any other country ought to be doing, and call it X. And we have to do X to compete in the global economy. How many times have we heard that? It's become sort of like a mantra. We have to cut down the government. We have to, it doesn't have to be, it's not just the right wing, it's not just the Republicans, right? Because you also hear we have to invest in our people so we can compete in the world economy. We have to invest in infrastructure so we have to compete in the world economy. We have to invest in R&D so we can compete in the world economy. Any number of things that you want to do. And it just sort of makes you start to think, when did it become the norm that everything we're going to be doing was for the world economy rather than the other way around? Why is it that we're supposed to be doing things for the world economy as opposed to the world economy doing things for us? Wasn't actually sort of the whole idea that globalization and the world markets and this openness and this new era was actually going to be benefiting us. And I think this way of thinking about the relationship between how we fit into globalization is a relatively recent narrative. It's a narrative really of the that started in the 1980s. That suddenly we started to look at the world economy in a very different way. We started to look at us being sort of in the service of the world economy, rather than the other way around. And what I'm trying to do in this book is actually to reverse or provide an alternative narrative, which I think sort of puts globalization in its proper sphere, which is to say, let's look at how globalization can work for us. What does that actually mean for how far we can push the globalization? What it means for the kind of rules we should place on globalization? What it means for the balance between the nation state, domestic policy making on the one hand, and global governance and international institutions on the other. Let me give you a bit of an idea about what's in the book, or what's the nature of the argument in the book, by sort of briefly going over 3 steps in the argument, or 3 building blocks in the argument. The first of these is the idea that markets and governments are complements. They're not substitutes. They say markets and governments go together. They're not at odds with each other. This is another one of these ideas, the fact that sort of markets and the states sort of have to get out of the way so that markets can work well. I think it's been one of the most destructive ideas in terms of our thinking about economic policies. When you think about what makes markets work well only when you have a broad range of strong institutions that underpin those markets. You don't have markets without legal institutions. Markets do not work well without regulatory institutions. Markets are given to instability if you don't have stabilizing institutions. And markets cannot last if you don't have legitimizing institutions. So markets aren't self-creating, they're not self-regulating, they're not self-stabilizing, they're not self-legitimizing. What makes markets last and provide for prosperity are these other institutions, mostly provided by collective action, by the public sector, by government in modern days. Think about the alphabet soup of regulatory institutions that you need to ensure that the products you buy on the marketplace are safe, or that banks most of the time do what they're supposed to be doing, or that when you run into a crisis, that the federal government is there to actually pump liquidity into the system, bail out banks that are going under so that the crisis won't go worse, and so forth. One of the striking regularities around us today is that actually markets work best when the governments are strongest, not the weakest. You can actually give this even a statistical meaning by looking at the correlation between how open an economy is to trade and how large the government or the public sector of an economy is. And this is very positively correlated. The most open economies in the world are in fact the ones where the governments are largest in terms of tax revenue or in terms of public spending. So the first idea is really just to get into our minds that if we want markets to work well, including global markets, we have to have very strong public institutions to ensure that markets work the way that they're supposed to do. The second idea, the second building block here, is the notion that when you think about how the state and various public institutions are organized to provide this infrastructure for market, to provide these undergirding of markets, there is not a single model. That market-based capitalism or market-based systems don't come in a single model. There is an almost infinite variety of models of market capitalism that you can think of. And not one of them is necessarily superior to the other. Every decade we have an idea of what the best model what the best economic model is. Do you remember the Japanese model of the 1980s? Sort of the idea was that here was sort of capitalism at its best, that everybody needed to become more like Japan. And of course, in the 1990s, it was the American model of financial capitalism, and look where that got us. Everybody's now talking about the Chinese model. Do we really want to be like China, or can anybody really be like China? The point is that when you think about how you regulate markets, what kind of labor market institutions to have, what kind of corporate governance, what kind of social protections and the welfare state. There are many, many different ways in which you can arrange those institutions, which means that, in fact, it is one of the major strengths of capitalism and why it has proved so durable, despite all its problems, is that it's very malleable. That you can sort of, the kind of capitalism we had even within a country in the United States, 19th century version of capitalism is very different from what we have today. So capitalism changes both across time and over space, and we shouldn't sort of fixate on this idea that if you want our economies to work well, that there is just one sort of big ideal that we have to all converge to. So second point here is that we really should think about the world as being comprised not as different societies or different market-based economies that are all necessarily converging to one single model, but one where countries ought to be able to express their desires and preferences with respect to exactly the shape those institutions ought to take. So that would be a world in which we accept the legitimate diversity of institutions undergirding capitalism. So that's point number two. Point number the third building block is the idea that when you think about how we decide collectively about what kind of institutions we should have, what kind of financial regulation, what kind of labor markets, what role should trade unions have in labor markets, how extensive should our social protections and the welfare state be. When we think about how we're designing those specific institutions of capitalism, who should be doing those thinking? And how should we decide? Well, in a democracy, you think that it ought to be decided through democratic deliberation, through democratic mechanisms of decision-making, accountability, and representation, right? And then you ask, what is the appropriate locus of that decision-making? Another way of asking that question is to say, where are political communities organized today in the world? By and large, political communities are organized at the nation state. Don't go looking for global governance anywhere. Don't go looking for global politics anywhere. Don't go looking for any of the institutions in the world having the kind of thick exchange of politics that we see at the level of domestic politics. So for very good reasons, and for the foreseeable future, we're going to have politics organized mostly at the level of nation states. That means that the nation state is going to remain with us, and we simply cannot wish it away. And all the talk about a flat world, a world without borders, where domestic governments are disappearing, is simply hogwash. If you look at the recent crisis, when you ask the question, when push comes to shove, who bailed out the banks, who bailed out the auto companies, who pumped the liquidity to inflate the economy, who stabilized demand, and who ultimately was the people actually felt was responsible. The answer to all of that is actually national governments. It wasn't the IMF, it wasn't the World Bank, it wasn't the World Trade Organization. So that's point number three, that political communities remain organized largely around nation states. So when you put those three building blocks together, you get a picture of how we should think about globalization and the future of globalization that I think is quite different from what a lot of sort of chatter around the future of globalization is. And this is a vision, this is a picture which I try to describe at greater detail in my book, which basically says that we need a better balance between the prerogatives of the nation state, between democratic nation states on the other, and the scope and the reach of markets. Since we cannot truly underpin global markets with global institutions democratically governed, we need to reduce our ambitions about how far we can push globalization. We cannot have what I call in the book hyper-globalization, a world in which we're trying to make world markets as integrated, as unified, as well-functioning as domestic markets. That might seem obvious, but it's remarkable how much of our policy efforts at the international level, in domestic level, are animated by that view, as if we can keep pushing on lowering barriers, removing barriers, so that we can have this single unified global market, when that's really an impossibility. So this is a vision of globalization, which I try to sketch out in the book, that puts the national democracies front and center, that says the global rules ought to leave room for domestic policymakers to design their own policies, their own institutions, their own preferences. And second, that you might think that this would be actually very detrimental to the world economy if all countries, all democracies in the world and other nation states were to decide just to go on the basis of what they want to do, that this might be the collapse of the world economy. I argue that that is in fact not correct. That is not true. A world in which, a world of democracies in which countries decide their own policies and settle on their own institutions, is actually a world that's going to be much more conducive to a healthy globalization than one where we simply try to rein in domestic policymakers as much as possible. And the reason for that is going back to where I started out with, which is that we can have a globalization, an economic globalization, only to the extent that people believe and actually see in practice that that is working towards the kinds of ends, both economic and social, that people want to see. And that's possible only when we have that kind of control and the strong institutional underpinnings of globalization are actually provided, and they can only be provided at the level of the nation states. So in a nutshell, this is what the book is about. It's about trying to argue something that might seem on the face of it counterintuitive and paradoxical, that we actually are going to have a better globalization, a healthier globalization, a better functioning world economy, if we actually give some more power to nation states, instead of assuming that we can keep sort of moving towards sort of global institutions or global governance or global rules or global governance that's going to help us create the world market work better. So let me just stop here. I'm happy to ask questions. I'm happy to get. I'm always happy to ask questions. I'm also happy to get some. Including those who want to disagree with me. So thanks again for coming. I'm happy to listen to you now. No, I think that's a great question. I mean, first of all, I think you're absolutely right that the conception of the global economy that we had with the Bretton Woods regime, sort of the set of rules that we had for let's say, the first 3 decades after the Second World War, were very different. And in a way, what I'm trying to do is get back to that earlier conception that I think had a better balance between domestic objectives and the global economy. And also, secondly, for the reasons you cite, we live in a very different world economy. Even if we go back to the spirit of that, we're not going to be able to go back to exactly the same. So, for the United States, let's say, maybe 30 years ago, the share of trade in GDP was about maybe 6 to 8%, and now it's more like double that. Not a huge amount, but it's double what it was. We're never going to go back to that, and that's not what I'm arguing. But what I'm arguing is the choices that we make as we go forward. And I think we do have many choices there, because the integration of markets and the progress of globalization it's not a process that just happens on its own. It's a process that we shape by the decisions that we make, by the decisions that we take in the World Trade Organizations, by the decisions that we take in the Basel Committee when we decide on capital adequacy rules. It's the decisions that we decide when the IMF decides whether capital controls are okay or not. So I think I am calling, I think, for a rather drastic change in mind frames, but I think in terms of what it does, that means in practice, and what I outline in the last chapter in the book in terms of some of the concrete things that we ought to be doing, those tend to be more marginal changes as we go forward. But I think cumulatively will have the impact that I want to see, which is to liberate policymakers in the right direction from this sort of self-imposed constraint that they have, whatever they have to do, they have to justify in terms of being competitive in global markets. Yeah, I think you know the difference between strong institutions and weak institutions by traveling to places where there are weak institutions or institutions. So it's a question about partly about enforcement. It's partly a question about who makes the rules, whether it's just a narrow elite or it's more broad-based. So therefore, ultimately a question about the durability of those rules. It's a question about how well those rules match up with the actual reality. So about, it's actually about the design of those. So you can say about financial regulation. Is it well designed? Was it actually designed to adequately deal with the kinds of risks that financial markets are facing? So it's partly about appropriate design, partly about the mechanisms of accountability and control, and partly about enforcement. Whether whatever you decide, you're actually able to implement those things. And I think, in terms of those dimensions, we look across the world. Of course, you see huge amounts of differences on all three dimensions. Well, it has had an impact on the rest of the world. I feel like I'm mainstream now. I mean, in many ways. I mean, I think when you look at, for example, how views have changed on capital controls, it's quite striking. Capital controls or freedom of mobility of financial capital is sort of like one of these bellwether things about how our approach to globalization. Whenever we get very skeptical about globalization, we say, let's regulate those short-term capital flows, the hot money that sort of can destroy economies because they can leave just as quickly as they can go. And then there are periods of time when we say, oh, it's wonderful, let's just money flow wherever it can go so that people can borrow and lend and sort of why interfere with these things? The gold standard in the 19th century was, of course, a period of very free capital flows. Then, sort of coming out of the Second World War, the thinking of the architects of the Bretton Woods regime, the architects of the IMF and the World Bank and so forth, including most prominently John Maynard Keynes, was that capital controls, that financial capital flows, this hot money flows, had been a reason why the world economy during the interwar period had been so unstable. So they said, we just want to, you have to have capital controls all over the place. You can't let short-term capital move around. And that was the reigning orthodoxy up until really the early 1980s. And in the 1980s, so people said, why bother? Why not? Just let capital flow freely. And for the last 30 years, that has been the orthodoxy. Countries, sort of have moved in the, sort of just letting financial flows move all around. Now, one area where, in fact, we've seen now this change happen very, very prominently is in the aftermath of the crisis. The IMF which had been on the sort of the leading edge of those who argue for freedom of capital mobility, the IMF has now come back last year and said, we think that there is a legitimate role for capital controls in the world economy, that actually may make sense. It's sort of like a total change in the mind frame. It's totally a result of the financial crisis and the effect of that. Now, I'm happy to say that my views on this haven't changed, because I always thought that capital controls ought to be part of the, sort of part of the tool. I could have written the IMF's, policy brief on this 20 years ago. But then at the time, I was looked at, as a bit of a maverick on these issues, and now that view has become, I think, much more mainstream. That has happened a little bit in the trade front as well. For example, the argument that I've repeatedly made, that if you want an open trade policy, you better have very strong social policies, very strong social protections. Again, that sort of has become more or less mainstream, even in the United States, where the idea that you really need to ensure that there's much better adjustment assistance, wage insurance or something else for people who lose their jobs, that it's good social policy, it's good economic policy, it's good political policy, that you need to have those things. So that has become more of a mainstream idea. What I think is sort of new in this book is that it's the broader conception, it's the broader architecture of trying to say, look, don't worry about the nation state getting too strong. Right now, the problem is not that the nation state is too strong. The problem is the nation state is too weak. And actually, by making the nation state a bit stronger, you'll make the world economy work better too. I think there's too much of a willingness to abdicate responsibility on the part of domestic politicians. And I think this, as part of the electorate, this is what we should not allow them to do. I think it's actually often is easier to deal with the power of money at the domestic level than it is when the same money's power is exercised in international fora. So a very concrete example is when you think about how we should regulate our financial system, how we should regulate our banks. There is, broadly speaking, two ways you can go. One way is to say, we want a globally consistent, harmonized system of financial regulation so that banks have a level playing field wherever they go. So they have a constant, they have a common set of regulations. The other way is you can say, well, we'll design our regulations ourselves. Even though they might differ from those in Europe, in Japan, in Canada, whatever, that it'll be US made. And for the same reason, Europe will say it'll be Europe made, Japan will say it's Japan made, and so forth. Now, what happens in practice, and what has happened when we've gone the first route, which is to sort of try to design these regulations at the global level, is because nobody here has any access to how these decisions are actually made in Basel, in Switzerland, where actually sort of a bunch of bankers get together and decide what the rules ought to be. That's how those rules have been designed in the past, by something called the Basel Committee on regulation. And so there we have no control. There it's really just money speaks, period. But if those things were actually determined, it was viewed that the right locus of decision making for those things were actually the domestic political setting, it would be much harder for the power of money to have. Money will always be powerful, but there will be much greater countervailing power than what has happened recently. So I think one advantage of actually drawing back some of this responsibility, bringing it back home, is that you get a much wider set of stakeholders and voices speaking on these issues. Now, when I talk about these to sort of economists and policymakers, then I say, oh my God, you're going to politicize these issues. That's exactly my point. I want to politicize these issues because a lot of this stuff is political, and just by sort of taking it out of this political domain, it's not like you're necessarily getting better outcomes. You're just getting just one set of voices determining the outcome. Well, let me say a word about sort of a comparison and then a word about what that means for globalization. I think when I look at those two countries, obviously China until very recently has done much, much better economically than India has. But I think the future looks much tougher for China than it does for India. And I think India has one huge advantage compared to China, which is that it is democratic, that it has those democratic mechanisms of governance. The most fundamental institutional transformation that a country needs before it becomes wealthy is already in India's past, whereas it's in China's future. So I think the critical question that China faces, in the next, not necessarily in the next couple of years, but certainly in the next couple of decades, how it's going to manage that huge institutional transformation of either becoming more democratic, or ultimately, if it doesn't become more democratic, I don't think its economic engine will continue to function nearly as well. It's obviously a question where the Chinese are extremely, extremely nervous in the context of these Middle Eastern, protests. The way that they've reacted suggests that they're very, 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 very concerned about this issue as well. But looking towards the future, this is one major sort of reason why I would bet on India rather than on China. In terms of what this implies, the rise of India and China implies for globalization, I would say this, that this feeds into and strengthens my argument. Granted, China is not a democracy. However, both China and India value intrinsically national sovereignty to an extent that it's become, sort of quaint in the advanced industrial countries. So, if we are going to be moving towards a world where the United States and Europe, the main internationalist powers in terms of global institution building, are becoming much less powerful. India and China are rising, and they put tremendous importance on the importance of national self-determination, the nation state, national sovereignty. Don't tell me what to do, I won't tell you what to do. That the stability of that world, the stability of the architecture of that world is possible only if you recognize that the nation state centrality has got to be maintained. So you cannot build a stable international economic order on the assumption that you're going to get all of these countries together and they will all agree on what their policies ought to be, or what they will all agree on a common set of financial policies, common set of trade policies, common set of labor market policies, and so forth. So the best that you can think of is actually think of a world in which you design traffic rules. How are you going to mediate these, the interface between these different institutional arrangements in these different countries? And that's exactly the kind of globalization that I think we ought to have anyhow. So this adds recognition that India and China are going to be now an ever-growing part of the world economy, adds an additional layer of practical necessity to the desirability of the kinds of global arrangements I've been advocating. I agree. I argue in the book that there are some global normative standards. So, for example, I would put democracy and human rights as one of those. I would say that that's a global normative standard. That democracy, that there's no nation state can legitimately say, I don't have to be democratic because I'm different. They can say, I need different kinds of financial regulations, or different kinds of labor market regulations, or different type of social protection because I need different. But I don't think any nation state can say from a normative standpoint that my people don't need democracy, or my people don't need human rights. So from that standpoint, I think there are those at that level at least, there are very strong normative standards. And the way that those work into my argument is to say that when we think about these traffic rules that we're going to be talking about, so part of these traffic rules are about thinking when should countries be allowed to opt out or exercise an escape clause from an international agreement? And there I would say that if you're a democracy, a prima facie democracy, that any decision you make on the face of it reflects the will of the people. And therefore, you don't have any reason to justify yourself as to why you're doing something. Whereas for a non-democracy, that argument doesn't fly. So a specific example of this would be to talk about, for example, labor standards, an issue of labor standards. I think India can legitimately say, because I'm a democracy, the labor standards I have reflect the will of my people. Now, of course, democracy, it works in all kinds of weird ways. But who am I to say that their democracy is worse than mine? So it's a very clear-cut stand that says that institutions that reflect, because those societies are democratic, are in some sense reflect the will of the people. And that's an argument that China cannot use. And therefore, these rules would actually discriminate between democracies and non-democracies, would set higher thresholds that non-democracies would have to jump over because of that. Yes, I mean, I think, if we have a deliberate, if our domestic trade policies and our domestic policies are being decided in the way that I suggest through domestic deliberative practices, there's no presumption that that means that the individual participants in that debate will care only about themselves, or only about their communities, or only about their nation states. They may very well, if you can convince them, or I can convince them, or as their own consciousness changes over time, because they care about what's happening elsewhere, they may very well start taking into account that their decisions have impact somewhere else, and that therefore there are some trade-offs, and therefore some things that they want that might be good for their communities might have harmful effect on other countries, and how to trade those off. So those are all deliberate, or those are all relevant considerations that should enter into our discussion. All that I'm saying is that the appropriate locus for that discussion for the foreseeable future is going to be the domestic setting, not transnationally through international NGOs or corporate social responsibility or any other kinds of global governance mechanism that you can think of. It's a question worth 3 books. I've written 2 of those. The third one is still to be written. I mean that of course is the is the big question, and the way that I think about this is in a number of steps. One is to really ask the question: do you have a government in place who actually is interested in economic development in the first place? Now, this might seem like a crazy question, but not all governments actually want economic development. Not because they're evil, but because there may have so many other constraints or so many other considerations. Keeping the ethnic balance, ensuring that cronies or whoever are being sufficiently fed and so forth. So the first consideration is that if you don't have a government that's going to make economic development a real priority, I mean you've lost it already. Then what you're going to get is a lot of fake action. You'll get a lot of aid, you'll get a lot of words, you're going to get a lot of missions, but you're not going to get it. You look at the big transitions in economic growth, economic development. Why is it that South Korea and Taiwan all of a sudden took off in the early 60s? Why did China all of a sudden took off in the late 70s? Why is it that Mauritius began to take off in the 70s? In all of these cases, you have governments that come into power and that really truly make economic growth and development a key priority. That's number one. Number two is you say, do you have a government that's sufficiently self-confident that it's going to rely on its own resources and on its own understanding of what its problems are? Because if you get a government that's simply going to invite the World Bank and the IMF and economists from Harvard to come and tell them what to do, and they think that's how you get economic development policy, it's simply not going to work. Because one of the key lessons from the history of development is that all successful development programs have a high degree of context specificity. Nobody would have been able to tell China that the way to develop was going to be the kind of two-track pricing and the special economic zones and the township and village enterprises that they came up with. No Western economist would have been able to dream up of these things. It was just thinking about sort of what might work here, being pragmatic, being experimental, and that requires sort of listening to advice, but also being sufficiently self-confident to understand that whatever works will have to be designed in light of local constraints and local opportunities. And that requires that kind of self-conscious confidence. And the third, I think, is a little bit more technical, but I think it's important. It's sort of being able to have clear sense of where the major constraints or obstacles to development are. It's clear that if you're a country like Mozambique, you can't turn yourself into Sweden overnight. So if you ask the World Bank, say, what should I do? The World Bank will come back and say, your institutions are rotten, you have to fix them. Your governance is rotten, you have to fix them. Your trade regime is rotten, you have to fix them. Your subsidies are rotten, you have to fix them. Your agricultural extension system is rotten, you have to fix them. So you can't do all of that all at once. But the lesson from economic history is the good news is that countries get rich without necessarily having to do it all at once. Because if you're so far behind on all dimensions, it's enough to do just a few things just to get going. So that's the potential. And so what you need at that point is really to figure out where the most significant obstacles to picking your economy up is. In some cases, it's just going to be that you truly have a corrupt leadership, and unless you really change your governance and send a different signal to the private sector, you won't get any action. So there you just have to work on the corruption issue. And maybe the trade policy, the agricultural extension, and other aspects of institutions can wait. In other places, you have a decent, maybe not a bad government, but what you have is really very high trade barriers. And then you have to work on that, and you can delay other things. In other cases, maybe that the banking system isn't working well and people aren't getting finance, and that's really the major obstacle. And if you fix that, you can get high growth for the next 10 years until the next thing becomes binding. So that step really requires sort of having a good sense of where you start, how you prioritize your reforms. So all successful countries have had these, broadly speaking, these three elements. The unfortunate thing is I cannot give you a recipe because, as I'm explaining to you, I think sort of when you look at the details of what countries have done, they've all given incentives to private markets to work, but they've always had also strong governments that have also played a role of leadership. And the devil has been in the details in the way that they've addressed those three key areas.
I'm sorry if I'm focusing the issue on a very...
No.
But I'm just curious to hear how you would justify this.
I made a very, very broad statement. At that level of, I think we can probably agree that India is a democratic country and China isn't. China has a fair amount of local democracy today, but it's certainly, you can't go out and vote for the people that you want, or you don't have the kind of civil liberties and press freedom that you have. And that, I think, also reflects itself in labor market arrangements. It is true that just very recently wages have begun to increase, but that reflects much more broadly sort of economic developments and not necessarily changes in bargaining, labor market bargaining, or changes in collective bargaining institutions or the power of unions in China. Yeah, the last chapter talks about 4 different areas. So in the area of trade policy, I talk about how the next round of trade sort of negotiations in the auspices of WTO ought to focus on the rules of the regime. What I called about this these new traffic rules that's going to enable countries to have greater room for their trade and industrial and other policies. So the idea is to change the what trade negotiators negotiate about from exchanging market access, which is I lower my barriers, you lower yours, instead of having that conversation, having a conversation about let me have more policy room in exchange for you having some more policy room, and can we design that in a way that's actually going to not create adverse spillovers on each other. In the area of financial market regulation, I talk about how we should allow different countries to design their own different financial regulations and allow them to interfere in cross-border flows through capital account management or other techniques to prevent financial market arbitrage. In other words, from flows from low regulation countries from undermining the integrity of regulations in the more highly regulated countries. In labor markets, I talk about how we could design a short-term temporary labor scheme where workers from poor countries can spend 3 to 5 years in the rich countries, reap the benefits of that kind of globalization, which I think have been actually quite limited. That's really in terms of expanding the global pie, that's really the most unexplored frontier that we have. And then finally, I talk about how we manage the rise of China and how we should deal with the question of macroeconomic imbalances and China's external surplus. So those are the areas that I talk about. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.